weather conditions, that we have data on the type of crop, and we have what are called genetic coefficients. So the different varieties and species of rice, and genetic coefficients go into models that predict the growth of the different species. So it's very precise, and it has a series of models that are nested. This is just one. I threw up this is one simple model that is in the whole nesting of the DSAT algorithm, modeling photosynthesis and respiration. And some of these models use integrals, some are more algebraic, most of them are deterministic.
Can you get from them how much carbon capturing do they do from the atmosphere? Or can you get some byproducts, like how much they recycle?
The output is, there are several dozen outputs that are generated in addition to the crop yield. It outputs the size of the grain, the size of the stems, the roots. I can't remember all the outputs. It does have a modeling of how it interacts with the atmosphere. So in that sense, CO2 levels matter. You can adjust the CO2 levels and you get different crop outputs. And in the climate change literature, there's something called the CO2 fertilization effect. That as the world is polluting and increasing emissions, that actually has a positive effect on plants, while the increase in temperature that results has a negative impact. So these things interact. This is just a general diagram showing how the model works with the different inputs. And this is a more precise model, which actually shows a diagram which shows all the different nested models that are going into this. So it's very complicated. It took a lot of time and effort to learn how to run it. And we worked with soil scientists down at the University of Florida to get their advice on how to precisely put in. Rob Townsend, in his surveys, has collected a lot of soil parameter information, and we needed to know the precise units and where it should be inputted and how it should be used correctly, and that was pretty complex.
Just to give me an idea, how much time did you have to spend on learning the application? How much time do you have to spend on formatting the data such that what you just mentioned, the soil?
Well, to learn how to run it took several months, and to format the data and get it in correctly, probably several weeks of work. And we're actually still working on it. We're trying to refine it because there's so many inputs. We hope to make it even better and to get some more advice from some of the experts so that our simulations are even more accurate. But a really important result that we got was that when we ran DSAT across these 1,000 plots, and we know the end of period harvest, we know the actual harvest amounts from Rob's survey data, we were able to get a positive correlation. So we're doing this across 1,000 plots, and we don't have the precise input data needed for each plot, but the overall trend, we had a correlation between the predicted and the actual yields.
So what makes this complicated? Does the running time depend directly with the number of plots that is being run on? Or?
Well, the running time's not too bad once you have all the data in.
Okay.
It's pretty fast, a couple hours to run a couple thousand plots. But getting all the data set up, and actually what we did that's kind of innovative, it's very rare that anyone's ever run it across so many plots simultaneously. Most of the published papers, there's many papers using DSAT, don't use so many crop plots, and they don't have, there was no software that existed that would allow us to batch input all our soil input data. So I kind of created my own, that I patched together a bunch of different software, and primary one that I used was Microsoft Word Mail Merge, because the input files for DSAT are text files that have a very particular format, and the inputs have to be inserted in the precise place with the correct number of digits. So I created a template in Word, and that read off an Excel file, and then I parsed that and converted it to ASCII, and was able to run it to generate a batch creation of the input files for the crop model. So the advantages of this, as I mentioned, are we can capture the crop response due to the climatic and soil conditions that gives us this lens to capture that. And we are able to model some of the main farmer inputs, fertilizer, planting date, and we can capture these nonlinear crop growth responses that are inherent in the DSAT model. Disadvantages is it tends to overpredict yields, and the soil scientists told us that's to be expected because there are certain stresses that the crop model doesn't see. Typically, it's calibrated. And
You mean just they don't put enough variance in the estimates?
no, it's that it's a simplification of reality, and in reality, there are certain stresses in the crop growing process that the crop model won't necessarily capture. So it tends to overpredict. It's like an idealized yield in a way of the predicted output. But that was useful to us because we wanted to know what would be sort of the ideal predicted yield given the biophysical conditions.
Does it, when it gives you a prediction, does it give some sort of like uncertainty around it, or it just gives?
No, it's a deterministic model. But we did sort of address that by running stochastic simulations, which I'll describe. So now we wanted to look at the impact of climate models, and we wanted to get predictions from climate models. I didn't know much about this field before I started this paper, but there are these coupled atmospheric oceanic general circulation models, which are sort of the state-of-the-art climate modeling. The National Center for Atmospheric Research in the U.S. Is very advanced in this. There's a center in the U.K. called the Hadley Center. They all produce these models that are run by large teams of scientists that predict future climate change, and they're assessed by running them for historical periods and seeing what is the residual between the predicted and the actual historical weather. And that way they can get an error measurement, and that provides a method of selecting the best models. These are very complicated models that model the whole global ocean circulation on the one hand and the entire atmospheric circulation on the other, and then couple them and run them forward in steps to see what the changes are. Now, when you have having these models is one thing, and that's really important. But then a key next step is to consider what are going to be the changes in emissions due to human-induced or anthropogenic changes. There's natural climate variability, and there's also what's called the anthropogenic signal, the climate change signal, which is due to human emissions. And there's no doubt there's a scientific consensus that is raising global temperatures. But what's unknown is what will be the future emissions, and that depends on economic scenarios. So we needed some scenarios to be able to derive predicted changes to temperature and precipitation based on the different scenarios. And this is actually describing that we didn't use the output of just one of these climate models, but rather an ensemble mean of more than 20 of them that were run together under the IPCC. The IPCC is the United Nations body on climate change. It's a huge meeting this coming December of that. I heard Hillary Clinton say the other day that they're definitely going to send a team from the U.S. to that meeting. So this organization runs these ensemble mean simulations, and this is actually a list of all the different models that went into the ensemble mean predictions. And we use those predictions under different scenarios of economic change.